Okay, hello everyone. This is Colin Cox, and this is the Week 2 audio lecture for English 1010 here at Northeast State Community College. If you have not listened to the Week 1 audio lecture, I would strongly encourage you to do that because a lot of what I say today, a lot of it is new, but it will build on many of the things that I said last week or in the last audio lecture, and I won't talk specifically or exclusively about the assignment prompt, which is something I do in the Week 1 audio. So if you certainly need more clarification about my expectations for this assignment, I would certainly encourage you to go and listen to that audio, perhaps multiple times, but especially once if you haven't listened to it already. So today I want to talk, I have perhaps two main objectives. I want to talk about the differences between internal and external conflicts because this is a conflict essay, which is to say one of the big themes for this essay will be or should be conflict and the nature of conflicts. And I also want to spend a bit of time not talking about both of the readings that I asked you to do. I'll certainly reference or say something about the Orwell essay, but I will spend most of my time today talking about the Bonnie Smith Yackle essay, My Mother Never Worked. But again, I want to start by briefly discussing the differences between internal and external conflicts, because I think this distinction is extremely important and might help to clarify some questions a lot of you have had to this point. So when I talk about internal and external conflicts, and I'll certainly try to use some examples that perhaps all of you or many of you have experienced, because I think that's often quite applicable, but think about internal conflicts as, and I'll start there, right? So think of internal conflicts as the sorts of feelings that you might have about situations in your life, things you experience, your own anxieties, frustrations, etc. So for example, imagine you want to have dinner, right? And I used a lot of food examples last time. Again, I assure you, I am not hungry. I just had lunch. But let us imagine that you want to go and have dinner, but you have certain social anxieties. Being in public is, for whatever reason, extremely hard for you. It causes you to doubt yourself. It causes you to indulge in negative thought patterns. Think of those thoughts and those feelings and those anxieties as internal conflicts. Now, by contrast, but they often work together, there are external conflicts. And again, I think the terminology really helps here. Think of external conflicts as things outside of yourself. So if you take the restaurant example that I just offered, imagine, for example, just all of the other tables and the people who might occupy those tables and their proximity to you physically. That's a clear external conflict, right? Or even the idea that there would be another human being or even a set of human beings that you would need to speak to, interact with. Perhaps you acknowledge that you would bring a distinct set of expectations to those interactions, or, and I think this is maybe the source of the anxiety if you just follow the example, that they would have certain expectations of you. But what I want you to notice, I want to pause over this just for a second, because I think what's useful about this example, and I think this is applicable to the essay that I want you to write, is how both internal and external conflicts are often deeply interwoven. More often than not, it's those external conflicts that lead to a particular set or just a single internal conflict. So while as you're thinking about this essay, while you're brainstorming this assignment, you might think to yourself, do I want the conflict in question to be an external conflict, or do I want it to be an internal conflict? I would argue some of the best essays that grapple with conflict grapple with both, and they see and understand the degree to which internal and external conflicts are deeply intertwined and deeply interwoven with one another. It's hard, I would argue, to just separate them and say this was, or just pick an example, right? This example was exclusively an external conflict, or this example was exclusively an internal conflict. Now, it may become clear, depending on the situation that you select, that you want to describe, that it is more one than the other, which is to say, if you just wanted to create an arbitrary percentage, it's 30% external conflict and 70% internal conflict. That's fine if you want to think of it in those terms. But I guess the point is, this is the thing I want you to remember. It's extremely rare for the kinds of conflicts that students write about to be exclusively an internal conflict or exclusively an external conflict. Often, again, it's the intersecting of those two together that often create the conflict, perhaps in a capital T, capital C sense. So take a second, and if you need to re-listen to that and maybe jot down a note or two, again, I think it's extremely important to understand the distinction between internal and external conflicts. But again, the point is, the thing that I really want you to take from this, they are deeply interwoven. It is not necessarily a case, if ever, I would argue, where we just have exclusively external or exclusively internal conflicts. Okay. With all of that said, I want us to transition, and because I think I want us to transition and talk about the reading, but I think both of them, in particular the Orwell essay, is a great example of how internal and external conflicts are interwoven. And again, while I won't speak a lot about the Orwell essay this week, I would encourage you just take that idea that it is an essay about both an internal and an external conflict. Take that idea, and if you haven't read the Orwell essay yet, or if you have, take a second and reread it and see if you can really ascertain or discover what I mean. Because I think for the narrator, who is the point of view figure for that essay, there's a clear external conflict, which you could argue perhaps it's embodied or symbolized with the elephant or by the elephant. But I think that external conflict, it creates the conditions for the narrator or the point of view figure to explore and perhaps even expose to us, the reader, a whole host of internal conflicts. But again, I want to focus exclusively today on the Bonnie Smith Yakel essay, My Mother Never Worked. A fantastic essay. It does a lot of structural or formal things that are really quite interesting. And one of the things that I want to talk about is how it uses something called a frame narrative. So notice how, and now if you haven't opened the essay or if you don't have the essay in front of you, take a second and do that. But notice where the essay both begins and ends, because this is an essay that explores from the writer's perspective her mother's life, and it attempts to chronicle or chart all of the ways that her mother worked, even if that work wasn't recognized as work. And that's a obviously fraught way of thinking about it and describing it. I think one of the interesting things this essay wants to expose is how we have for far too often, and I think a lot of this still lingers, how we have for far too often defined work in very narrow terms, and there needs to be, it seems, right, for these really narrow definitions of work, certain conditions. We must meet certain conditions for something to be, or for the state or society to recognize something as work. But I think what Bonnie Smith Yakel wants to do is certainly challenge that idea that work, that we should define work in these really narrow terms. And she wants perhaps a more expansive and perhaps a more inclusive understanding of what work is. But if you, again, as I was saying earlier, if you look at how the essay begins and ends, it doesn't begin and end really with her mother at all. It begins and ends with this conversation that Bonnie Smith Yakel apparently has with a social security agent, or someone just answering the phones at her local social security office. And having that as both a way of beginning and ending this essay is an active attempt to deploy something called a frame narrative. And think about, for example, how frames work with visual art or pictures, right? So you have the picture, but then you also have this decorative or ornate frame, right? And I think we all understand that even if a frame is ornate and decorative and beautiful, it's really just a means to a greater end. And that greater end is the picture that's encased, or the piece of art encased in the frame. Narrative does something quite similar. You could even argue in fiction or film, using a flashback, which is something maybe a lot of you have witnessed before or something you've noticed before. That's a kind of frame narrative. But the idea is to create or establish the conditions for potentially something more interesting to occur. However, with that said, I think the frame is extremely important for this essay because it is as if the essay itself, that which is contained within the frame, is a response to the frame. And that's what I think, again, is so fascinating about this essay, because the essay ends on a really compelling bit of irony that I think does the work of articulating the thesis statement for this piece. And again, think back to something I spoke about in the week 1 audio lecture about the differences between implicit and explicit thesis statements. I certainly think the thesis statement for this essay is a lot clearer, but how Yakl articulates it is fascinating because she articulates it through the deployment of this moment of irony. And again, I think the point is it's only irony for us, the reader. It's not irony for this person at the Social Security office that Bonnie Smith Yakl speaks to. So for example, go to the end of the essay. I think I found your mother's records. Martha Ruth Smith, married to Ben F. Smith. Yes, that's right. Well, I see that she was getting a widow's pension. Yes, that's right. Well, your mother isn't entitled to our $255 death benefit. Not entitled, but why? The voice on the telephone explains patiently. Well, you see, your mother never worked. And again, I think ending the essay there, and this is where I said this a moment ago, I'll reiterate it. This is why I think the frame is so important. Because the frame allows us to better understand, through this deployment of irony at the end, just how silly of a phrase or how silly of an idea that is. Of course she worked. We just experienced all of the ways that she worked. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. But the point is, the thing that I would argue is so important for all of you when thinking about this as a potential example, not only can you deploy this kind of a frame narrative in your own essays, not only can you deploy dialogue as well, which I think this essay is a great example of how to use dialogue in a nonfiction essay, but I think this is a great example of how using irony and especially tone, right? Because I think if we were in a traditional classroom, one of the questions I would ask all of you is, how do you think Bonnie Smith Yakl wants us to interpret the end of this essay? I think the only way to interpret it is to almost laugh, but laugh in a way that, like, if you've ever had this moment when someone said something that was so absurd, all you could do was laugh in response because you might think to yourself, how could someone think that? Or how could someone say that? I think that's precisely the reaction that we have here. How could someone ever argue that she doesn't work? But again, I think by deploying irony in this way, by deploying the thesis statement the way she does through this frame narrative, which again borrows or utilizes irony in such an interesting way, she really provokes us as readers into thinking through how, again, not just the Social Security office in the United States, but I think how culture at large really thinks and understands what it means for someone to work, how we define work, because work is not just an activity, but work is also a noun. It's something that we define. It's something that has clear definitional parameters to it. And if we have a too narrow definition of work, then it often has the effect of excluding people from all of the, let us say, symbolic benefits of having society perceive you as a person who works. Because think about, and again, I think this is really important. Pause over this just for a second and think about how we as a culture often think about people who work and people who, again, don't work. But I would use scare quotes, right? When using language like don't work, I think we often assume or believe that people who work have maybe greater moral character to them, or they have more fortitude. Maybe they're just better people, right? Because they work. And it's not just this binary distinction between work and not work. We also have this scale, right? We define some work as just better than other forms of work, or some jobs as better than other jobs. But I think part of what Bonnie Smith Yakel wants to do here, and I think this is really getting to the point of what she wants to argue, she wants us to consider, she wants to challenge these ways that we've often thought about work. And again, I think it's so important to also consider some of the language that she uses in the title, right? My mother never worked. I think you cannot ignore the gender or the gender dynamics at play in this essay, because again, now we're thinking more about tradition, right? Traditionally, and I think some of those traditions still linger today, we often assume that in a traditional heteronormative marriage or relationship, if there are children, if there are domestic duties, often traditionally, women were the ones who were expected to remain at home in those domestic spaces doing that work. So I think part of what Bonnie Smith Yakel wants to do as well is ask us to think about, well, why are there other reasons why, aside from just the mechanics of work itself, that might lead us to think of some forms of work as legitimate, while dismissing or ignoring or defining other forms of work as illegitimate? Again, I think all of those interesting and complex questions are at play in this essay. But for now, I want to actually transition to the content of the essay itself, or that which exists within the frame. And part of what I really like about this essay is how Bonnie Smith Yakel, this I think, after a first pass, or if you read this essay more than once, you come to the realization that this is far from a comprehensive exploration of all of the work that her mother did, even though we have all of these clear dates, even though Bonnie Smith Yakel is quite clear about when things happen. This is just a quick summary of all the work she did, and it's a lot of work, right? I've never worked on a farm before. Maybe any of you listening to this have worked on a farm, and so you read this essay and you think, my God, yeah, there's a lot of this, but there's so much more that she doesn't address, and that's what I think is interesting as well. That's not to say that this essay is superficial, because it certainly is not, but this is more than anything just a quick and superficial definition of all of the work she did, which again should cause us to pause and reflect on all of the work that we often don't see, don't recognize, don't acknowledge, because I think that's so significant to this essay, in particular the work that women perform, the unseen, unacknowledged, unrecognized work that women often perform. And what I also think is interesting about this essay is how Bonnie Smith Yakel's mother, by her description, seemed quite skeptical or even dubious of the idea of even getting married, right? And listen, if Bonnie Smith Yakel wrote this essay in 2022 about a woman even born, 25, 30 years ago, maybe that wouldn't seem so radical, or maybe that wouldn't seem so atypical, but this was in the early 20th century. This was before women even had the right to vote in this country. Remember, women did not receive the right to vote until 1920. So Bonnie Smith Yackle, her mother and father didn't marry until 1921, which means a lot of this courting, a lot of these courtship rituals occurred before Bonnie Smith Yackle's mother even legally had the right to vote in this country. So what I think is fascinating about her mother is how she didn't, by Bonnie Smith Yackle's description, she did not want a marriage as a way of securing her status, but also securing her financially in a world where she didn't have the same amount of rights or the same kinds of rights as her male counterparts. In that way, she was something of a trailblazer. She did decide to marry in 1921, but I think it's significant for Bonnie Smith Yackle to acknowledge that marriage wasn't her first option necessarily, and she was quite skeptical and dubious of the idea. Sorry, I just hit my desk, but she was quite skeptical and dubious of the idea of even getting married. So I think that's, again, it's different. It's interesting. I think it causes us to perhaps think differently about her mother, that her mother in many ways was perhaps not like a lot of the people around her. That's not to say that Bonnie Smith Yackle's mother was the only person in the early 20th century who looked skeptically upon marriage, but I don't think I need to explain how that's something that I think society at large would have looked upon with a fair amount of skepticism. Perhaps even today, my God, there's some skepticism to the idea, oh, you don't want to get married. That's interesting, right? Even though I think there's certainly there's more acceptance today to the idea that someone wouldn't want to seek marriage as an option. But again, Bonnie Smith Yackle traces all of the ways that her mother works. But again, notice how the work, it's not consistent or predictable work, it seems. And what I mean by that is she's asked to do a lot at a lot of different times. And I can only imagine it might be hard to create or establish a routine considering all of the things that she's asked to do and all of the variables at play. So I think part of what Bonnie Smith Yackle wants to do is to suggest that her mother was an incredibly adaptable person. She was someone who seemed to have a lot of patience, because I think you need to be a patient person to adjust to and react positively to all of those shifts and changes and just all of that unpredictability, right? There was a lot about her life that was difficult to predict, and I think that's quite hard to do, but it's something that her mother was able to do quite seamlessly by her account. So I think that's something else as well, right? If we're thinking about, well, what kinds of work do we often ignore or not acknowledge? I think that kind of emotional work, right? Someone who's able to just seamlessly adapt to difficult situations. That's, for example, something that's quite difficult for me to do. I don't adapt well to new situations. I like my routines. I like things to be predictable. And when I am forced to adapt to new situations, it's emotionally challenging at times for me to do that. So for her mother to just do it, and again, by Bonnie Smith Yackle's account, it seemed quite easy for her, but I wonder if we should be skeptical of that. I wonder if part of what's so amazing about her mother, or part of what was so amazing about her mother, was how she was able to both do this physical hard labor while also doing this unseen but perhaps equally important emotional labor. So something else that I think we see quite often throughout this essay, which is part of this emotional labor that I was speaking about, is just how many children she had, but also how many children died. And I think, again, that's something that Bonnie Smith Yackle references. It's something that she acknowledges, but she doesn't really explore it in a lot of detail. And I'm curious to know what you think about this. Why isn't there more time? Why doesn't she spend more time exploring how emotionally traumatic it is for people to lose children? Is it because she doesn't want to speculate wildly without having her mother there to confirm those speculations? Perhaps, right? But I think one way to read it, and I'll just offer this as one option, is it's all part of just this long, hard trajectory that was her life as work. And I'll just leave it at that. And again, I think part of what Bonnie Smith Yakel wants to do here is to suggest that not only rearing children, not only raising children, but grappling with the grief of losing children is work. And it's work that perhaps we should acknowledge in some way as work. And I think, again, the question maybe that Bonnie Smith Yakel wants to ask or explore is, what are the consequences of seeing that as work? What are the consequences of seeing grief and mourning as work? Are there any positive benefits to that? What do we think would happen to society if we had a more robust or inclusive or dynamic understanding of what work looks like? And what would be the consequences of acknowledging grief for people who birth children, especially when they lose those births or when they lose those pregnancies, when they have miscarriages? What would be the positive consequences of acknowledging that as legitimate work? Fascinating question to ask. Part of what I also think is interesting about this essay is how, for Bonnie Smith Yakel, her mother's work life never seems to end. Notice, for example, near the end of her life, she has some obvious mobility problems because of a car accident she sustains. But in the face of that challenge, in the face of that obstacle, it's fascinating how, for lack of a better phrase, Bonnie Smith Yakel's mother just doesn't stop working. She sees it as a challenge to confront and potentially defeat. So this is near the end of the essay. In 1969, on a June afternoon, mother and father started out for town so that she could buy sugar to make rhubarb jam for a daughter who lived in Texas. The car crashed into a ditch. She was paralyzed from the waist down. And then a year later, so this is in 1970. In 1970, her husband, my father, died. My mother struggled to regain some competence and dignity and order in her life. And notice how she combines those three in one sentence: competence, dignity, order. I think those three are so important for thinking about her mother. They're not separate ideas or concepts, feelings or emotions, or even states of being. They're all deeply intertwined. At the Rehabilitation Institute, where they gave her physical therapy and trained her to live usefully in a wheelchair, the therapist told me she did 15 push-ups today. 15. She's almost 75 years old. I've never known a woman so strong. So even by Bonnie Smith Yakel's account, even near the end of her life, when we often think people should have the privilege of doing less, working less, resting, relaxing, etc., all of that seems counterintuitive to her mother. So even near the end of her life, the idea that work, while it shifted and changed, while the particulars, while the parameters were different, she was still a person who worked. So again, I think all of this, if you think back to what I said at the beginning when I started talking about this essay, the irony of how the essay ends, right? Well, your mother never worked, it's like how, again, we as readers are in a privileged position because of the framing device she uses, but we read that and, we just chuckle, I suppose, or perhaps we're angry, we're indignant. Like, how could you think that? How could you say that? Because this woman's life was work. What a great bit of irony to define this woman as a person who never worked, because it seemed like her life was just work personified. And again, I've spoken about how this essay wants to explore the differences between, again, if we're just thinking in a traditional sense, the differences between how society thinks about the kinds of work that men performed and men did, and the kinds of work that women performed and women did, and why some of that work, while some of it was conferred a kind of legitimacy, some of it was not. And I think often, whether it's Social Security benefits, whether it's a paycheck, there's all of these ways that we there's all of these structural ways that we confer legitimacy to some activities, some behavior, some forms of work, and we confer a kind of equal amount of illegitimacy to other forms of work, other behavior, other activities, etc. So, okay, I think that's where I want to stop for now. Again, think back to what I said earlier in this lecture about the differences between internal and external conflicts, because again, I think both of the essays that I asked you to read beautifully explore the interconnectedness between internal and external conflicts, because I think that is relevant for the work that I want you to do. But also think about these essays as examples. Use, for example, a framing device. If you want, you can. This is not something that I will discourage you from doing. Deploy dialogue if it's useful, because again, I think the Bonnie Smith-Yackel essay is a perfect example of how you can and should deploy dialogue if you are so inclined. Okay, please contact me if you have any questions. Thank you for listening, and have a lovely week.